Welcome to the debut edition of the Anything Mentionable podcast. I'm your host, Tim Madigan. Sam Esquivel, my producer, and I are sitting here after a wonderful hour we just spent with my good friend and someone that a lot of my listeners will know, Dr. Patrick O'Malley, a grief therapist, a beloved grief therapist in Fort Worth, and now a professor at TCU. And we talked about her book, Getting Grief Right, Finding Your Story of Love and the Sorrow of Loss. And basically, I think you can summarize it by saying we talked about what it means to be most human. We talked about how suffering is universal, but the normal pain of life doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means you're human. And so Patrick uses a lot of principles about trying to normalize grief and normalize suffering, and the power of story shared and received by a trusting friend in the healing process, and how you can support grieving people. It was just everything I could have hoped for. Patrick and I have been good friends for a long time, and I've been the beneficiary of his wisdom and kindness. And I think that the listeners to this new podcast will similarly benefit. We're all looking for a safe place. We're all looking for kindness and compassion and meaning. And I think that you listen to Patrick for an hour, you'll find those things. And I hope you enjoy the podcast and will join us, continue to join us as we move on from here. And enjoy the episode. My guest in this, the first episode of the Anything Mentionable podcast, is my good friend, Dr. Patrick O'Malley. In a therapy practice that stretched across 4 decades, Patrick was one of the most respected and beloved practitioners in Fort Worth, Texas, often specializing in working with grieving people. In 2017, he published Getting Grief Right, Finding Your Story of Love and the Sorrow of Loss. It was my honor to serve as Patrick's co-author for that book, which has found an audience of thousands and continues to be a source of information and healing for grieving people. He is now an assistant professor of physician communication with the Burnett School of Medicine at Texas Christian University. It's always good to be with you, my friend.
Well, I am honored to be in this inaugural broadcast. Thank you for asking me.
There's actually a lot of pressure involved here.
Well,
being the first, this could be a one and done if you don't carry the weight, carry the water.
This is large, and rest assured I'm taking it full on.
Well, I'm thinking about, in reflecting on our friendship in preparation for this, we are, very close friends by any definition of that. And one of the great benefits of that long friendship over the years has been all the free therapy I've gotten. And so I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you, to say publicly that I appreciate that, and it was much needed. And in fact, you probably think of me as your pro bono friend, but that's just kind of is what it is.
Well, you're welcome, and it's time for you to thank me for that.
Am I not going to be getting a bill?
Let me assure you and our listeners that I've benefited much from our friendship, and I'm grateful for it.
That's awfully nice of you to say. It's good to be here. And one of the things that, if I could pontificate for a minute, in thinking about this, one of the reasons why it's your perfect first guest is that our friendship, the book, and our mission, shared mission in life, I think, at least I've come to believe that one of the things that greatly afflicts humanity is that we don't know how to suffer. We don't know. We're not good at being in pain, which is a really unfortunate thing, given that human suffering and the pain of living are universal. I mean, everyone suffers to one degree or another, often to a larger degree than any that people are willing to admit. And yet, we continue to feel like that kind of existential, universal suffering is some kind of a character defect. That there's something wrong with us when we're angry or sad or afraid or have self-doubts. When in reality, as Fred said, what is most personal is most universal. And so we endeavor so mightily to conceal those things from one another for all the reasons It's that if people knew how we felt, then they really wouldn't like us. That people just don't have an understanding that the person sitting across the table from you is going through stuff too. And it's a sense of isolation, I think, that it is so destructive. Isolation, repression, and that when you don't feel there's a path to healing, but it involves feeling those feelings, acknowledging them, respecting them, not running from them. But when you don't do that, those feelings come out in all kinds of unpleasant ways. And what is the quote from Richard Rohr you like to use?
If we can experience our suffering, it can be transformative. If we resist it, then we transmit it.
Right. Yeah. And that's what this is about. And I think that while we'll be spending most of our time today talking about grief, I think that the principles that we're going to be speaking of can be applied quite generally. Living loss is your term for it. Job loss, relationships, health, politics, all those things. So anyway, respond to that if you would.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind to respond to. One is much of the time I spent with clients was dealing with their resistance to the suffering, that the energy that they put into resisting suffering really impaired, if you will, the room to suffer, as you just described. One of the chapters in the book that I think was unique but also really relevant, we have a chapter called The Culture of Positivity. And that came by looking at some research about that sort of assumed culture and where it came from. And the discovery there was that it was sort of mid-1800s. The first version of that was sort of faith healing, that if you managed how you thought about your situation physically, it could help you heal. And it has really had numerous versions since then, and one author described it really as a unique American religion, that if you are not thought of as a positive person, you're thought of less well. And that, by definition then, that starts to label emotions. So grief and sadness and anger and fill in the blank that comes along with loss would have to, in that sort of binary way of describing it, have to be labeled as a negative emotion rather than just as this is what you're feeling.
Just as an emotion.
Just as an emotion. So the minute we start labeling, that starts to create what we've talked about and what I talk a lot about when I teach this and talk about it. It starts to create grief shame. It's the what's wrong with me.
That has been, again, something that I've thought about and talked about a lot over the years. And, I was a friend with Fred Rogers, and that was a big part of his mission and message is that it's okay to basically to invite people to come out of the shadows and share their stuff with people they can trust. Obviously, you have to have some discernment along those lines. But there's a play based on my book, I'm Proud of You, about my memoir of my friendship with Fred. That plug the play if I could. It'll be produced at Theater Arlington in early August. But there's a line, Fred and I were friends at a time in a very low time in my life when I shared with him deeply about some of what he called the furies that I was experiencing. And there's a line in the play, and I think Fred said this to me. He said, "Tim, it's normal." And I think the normalizing suffering, normalizing grief would go a long way to help people heal and to create a better world. Anyway, let's start with the book. Tell me your story about getting grief right and how it came to be.
Well, you and I have pondered for years, and neither of us can remember how we met. But we would have intermittent lunches, and then you wouldn't hear from each other for a while, and then would reconnect. Well, my recollection is you were working on a novel, and you wanted, I think your word was you wanted the characters to be psychologically sicker than you were making them, and could I pitch in? And I said, I can do that. Yes, I know how to do that.
And you did it very well,
thank you. So I read your manuscript, and we redefined some of their character flaws. And I said, well, here's the trade-off. I want you to, I think at that point we were having lunch, and I wanted you to look at the outline I'd come up with, because I've been thinking about this book for so long. My first version of the book was to interview other folks, maybe folks who had some social recognition about their loss. And in the development of that, I had mentioned that I was a bereaved parent, that my son had died, but that wasn't what the book was going to be about. The book was going to be more interviews of others. And you read over my, put together proposal, and the line that you said was, "You have buried the lead. This needs to be about you and your story. You don't need to go seeking other stories. You have your story right here." And that was the beginning of us. And you said, and I'm not sure why you said this, but it was the right thing, "You're not going to be able to write this without me."
He said humbly.
He says humbly. And that caused me pause, but I trusted you enough to know that that was true. And certainly you had navigated the publication world quite well with previous publications, Mr. Rogers' book and Tulsa book and other things you had done. So then I think what happened was we started thinking about what this needed to look like. And we put together a proposal, and I started shopping for agents. And so I got a list of, it's like a book with 100 or 1,000 agents. I don't know how many, every agent in the country. And so alphabetically, I started sending the proposal to them. And I remember where we were in the alphabet. I was in the K's. And so parallel to that, I had been noticing a article series in the New York Times called Couch, C-O-U-C-H. I mean, it was stories of therapists and people who had been in therapy. So I proposed to you, I said, I think I could write up an article for that and see what happens. Because at that point we were, several months into rejections of the proposal. So I wrote the article. I think you looked it over. We cleaned it up, and I sent it on to the New York Times. So I sent it, let's say, on a Monday or a Tuesday, and immediately heard from them. And they did their editing thing, and I signed off on all that. We worked it out. And then it was published above the fold, as they say, back in paper days, on January 10th, I remember that date, 2015. So it was published the next Sunday. So it just began a wildfire of responses, a lot of people writing in. According to the editor, it was one of the most shared articles in the New York Times history up to that point. By that, I guess they mean they can monitor people sending it to other people. So that was Sunday. By Monday, we had an agent. So, and her name started with K. That's how I remember that. So she called and had read the article and wanted to talk about that. And so there it was. So the premise of the article was that and the article was the same title as the book, was that I told the story of a woman who came to see me whose baby had died from sudden death syndrome. And she was what I call a high achiever griever. She was going to get it right. So she had read Kubler-Ross and knew the 5 stages of loss and knew that she wasn't getting it right because she hadn't gotten to acceptance or she wasn't angry. I mean, she had self-diagnosed. And so I shared with her, I shared in the article that as a bereaved parent, I had gone through a real similar process of thinking, what's wrong with me? And usually in the context of grief, when people are asking that question, it means that it's either too intense or too long or both. And so at that point, I'd shifted to what, through a series of my own reflections and changes, I had shifted to a prescribed approach to grief, like steps and stages, to what I would call a narrative grief. The grief is a story that has chapters.
We'll obviously talk more about that in just a minute, but it was an extreme, in 2015, 10 years ago now, and it's a nice kind of linear thing, but what was it? What was the reaction to that magazine piece, and could you summarize that? What were people most responding to that?
I think the theme of response was relief, meaning maybe nothing's wrong with me. That what the article did was, again, look at grief as a story of love rather than something that's diagnosable and pathological.
Right.
And if I think back through so many of the responses I got, it was that. And I think it began there were other voices going on, but I think it was the front edge of this idea that started off as what I would describe relief, that maybe nothing's wrong with me. And then we'll talk a little bit later about how that's progressed in 10 years, because now it's more of an edgy, don't tell me how to grieve.
Right.
It's really a strong ownership of grief. But to answer your question, that I think was the primary response, was maybe nothing's wrong with me.
And just because basically what had been happening, not only with grief, but with so many of these other difficult things, is that it had been pathologized. And not to say that there isn't occasionally some pathology involved in things that you were always careful to be aware of, right, if that were the case. But just to say, no, this isn't a disease. There's nothing wrong with you. This is part of being a human being. And so, I just think that piece, as I think you referred to before, we in addition to the original universal suffering, we pile on another layer or two of suffering, of shame and self-judgment. That I think that once you take away those other layers, the experience of suffering looks a lot different and proceeds in a different way. So we got a contract with Sounds True. We wrote the book. It was one of my favorite experiences of my career, because I was thinking about this the other day too, that part of the process of the book is we'd sit in your office and have hours and hours and hours and hours of conversations on this topic, not only your own personal experience, but the experience of your clients and the evolution of things. And it was just a deeply profound personal experience for me. And I think that we're proud of how it turned out and the people that it's helped over the years. So describe the arc of the book. I mean, you and your wife Nancy had suffered a great loss early in your marriage, and obviously it was a terribly difficult thing for you and your wife and your family. But so just tell me about the book leading up to kind of the breakthrough we describe. Your own, basically, you had worked so hard as a therapist, as a professional, to try to deal with your own grief. But did all the right things, did different forms of therapy, and studied Kubler-Ross, and basically tried to incorporate a lot of what you're learning in your own personal journey to help your clients. And you became known in Fort Worth as the therapist who had suffered a loss, and so you became kind of the go-to person. So just talk about the evolution of that and getting to the kind of the moment of breakthrough.
I was, a very young therapist at the point where my son died, and every colleague I talk to that's my age range, and even some that are past that have gone through training, got very little training about grief in therapy school. It was usually embedded in a chapter about family life development. So I knew nothing about grief in terms of what it really looked like and what it was. So all I had was the current model, which was mostly Kubler-Ross. And yes, so after my son died, I was in therapy 2 or 3 times. I read what I could, and I just got a large number of folks coming in to see me because the word was out that here's a guy who's actually experienced it, not just in the books. And so over the course of the next years, I was what I would call a prescriptive therapist. If you do your work, your grief work, you will get to a place where you have closure and you are healed. Those were the kind of words that were strong in therapy land at that point. And what I noticed is it wasn't really happening for me, and it really began to feel disingenuous. I started then, I kind of got to a point in the practice where I said, to be honest with myself, I need to quit preaching something that didn't working for me. And so I made this shift where I really began to listen to people's stories. And there's one pivotal story we talk about in the book that a kind of rough and tumble guy who ran a construction company, his dad had died, and he came in to see me, and I started with my usual, here's what grief looks like, a series of stages we go through, and we get to this place of acceptance and closure.
If I remember correctly, he was there under duress.
He was there under duress.
His preacher, his pastor, and his wife said, you need to get some help.
Yeah, I've been drinking a little extra. He'd been irritable. So, yes, and that often happens as a therapist. It's a tough case if somebody's not there voluntarily. And so he kind of came in thinking this is bogus anyway. And I knew enough at that point as a therapist not to fight resistance. And so I didn't try to compel him to come. We made a deal, let's do one session and see what you think. So I started on here's how it works. And he kind of cut me off and just started telling stories about his dad and his relationship with his dad, growing up and them in business together. And I thought, I'm worthless here. All I'm doing is hearing these stories and not doing anything therapeutic.
And he's not doing any work.
He's not working.
Yeah.
I'm not moving him along.
Right.
And then in that session, it occurred to me as I watched him do this, that this may be his therapy, is telling this story. And my job is to receive this story. And it was sort of an eye-opening moment of saying, I need to rethink this. What I have been doing is not working for me. I got to assume it may not be working, maybe even doing some damage to my clients. So we wrapped that session up, and I said, well, that's our deal. If you want to come back, fine. He says, well, I'll come one more time. So back he came, and he got back into the story. And then he worked his way up to the moment of his dad's heart attack and death, and standing in the emergency department at the hospital seeing his deceased dad. And I didn't have to get him there. It was part of his story. And so then I saw what we would look for in therapy, and that is more of an emotional disclosing moment. And so he may have come another time or two, but it occurred to me that's really all he needed. Well, what he needed was a lot, which was somebody just to listen to his story. And as often happens, we have an experience, at least for me, have an experience, and then I start looking for evidence to back it up.
Let me stop you there, because the first session was very organic. He was he was a natural storyteller, basically establishing, basically the specific things about how his dad had affected his life. The things large and small that they would do together, the times they spent together. But to me, and just thinking about it now, when I'm listening, is that what he was doing was he was establishing the kind of the basis of the love that he had for his father.
Exactly. Yeah, and that is a segue into where I was headed, which was I began to look at attachment theory, which had come out at that point.
If I could interrupt you one more time before we get there. So he's a macho guy, right?
Right.
Not. But so what was it like for him, and what do you remember about that when he got to the moment of his father's death, and what was his obvious reaction to sharing that?
Yeah, I could see it was hard. He was somewhat self-conscious about the emotions he was feeling, but he leaned into it. He let it happen. I think enough trust had been built by him understanding I wasn't going to lead him anywhere, and I wasn't going to be on the team of getting him well, like his wife and his pastor. That what he had, what I would call now a safe space to tell that story any way he needed to tell it. And so it was, if you kind of think of story arc, the early part of his storytelling was his youth with his dad, his going into business, or even before then getting in trouble with his dad, and how his dad managed all of that. And then leading up to the moment of his dad's death, him getting the call to come to the emergency room. And so to answer your question, what I saw was an expression of love. That's started to form that grief, rather than being a symptomatic pathological condition, is an expression of love. And a way that we live in that is to tell the story and to have somebody receive the story. And to your point, if he'd gone on and he'd continue to see me and we determined together that maybe he had an alcohol dependence level, we would have dealt with what needed to be dealt with. But the primary thing that happened for him, I think, was the freedom and a safe space. He didn't have to take care of me. He didn't have to worry about how he looked. He just needed to tell a story.
This is, there's a reason I think we use that story, because it's so representative of some of the important principles that you would later come to incorporate as a matter of course into your practice. The story being one of them, and it's reasonable to ask, finding your story of love in the sorrow of loss. Well, why is that important? Why is the story important? But you also tell stories in the book, and this is a fairly frequent phenomenon, I think, was that people would come in to you self-diagnosed, often based on the steps and stages. I'm not angry, I'm not this, I'm not that, and therefore there's something wrong with me. And you would, and correct me if I'm wrong, but and you would say, okay, well, I hear you, but let's put that aside for a moment. Tell me about this person. And so they would, in various ways, in various degrees, and all this sort of thing. And you would listen, and then you would often say, and at the end of hearing this, they say some form of, there's nothing wrong with you. You're sad. And after the story you just told me, how could you be anything but sad? And they would go, oh. And I think in a lot of times, if I'm remembering this correctly, you cost yourself some business because if I'm not sick, I don't need to see a therapist. And it's just, so I think telling the story is not only cathartic, but it makes people understand their own feelings. And so when you say you're not sick, you're just sad, they go, oh yeah, okay, I get that.
Well, and the next part of that is you are sad because you loved.
Exactly.
And the shorter version of the whole book in the New York Times article was that, she was a strong "what's wrong with me" experience. And when I framed to her, as we say, that this was about love, not about something wrong with you, then it changes the whole energy. But yes, to what you're saying, that would be often the course. The Kubler-Ross material had so worked its way into popular culture. It moved out of books and it was in magazine articles and talk shows and whatever. And so that, again, was the model, and you will still hear that. I read the paper this week, and this was never a Kubler-Ross word, but it got associated with it, that a family is trying to find closure. And what that suggests is something's going to close.
Right.
That the emotional experience we're having will be different and close. So, yes, so what would happen is often, once I made that shift, that's exactly the arc of their story would end with their understanding that there was nothing wrong. That, they say something like, well, how long is this going to last? And I'd say, well, how deeply did you love?
Exactly.
And
you developed almost an equation of sorts.
Yeah. And that began to change people's experience. And to your point, I've often said I was busier than I should have been because people didn't have anywhere else to tell their story.
Right.
Because the well-meaning friend would often try and give advice or would be suspicious about how long it was taken. There'd be some message that what you're doing is not right.
And that is your experience in therapy with this gentleman and with so many others is very instructive in terms of how people can and should be to support a grieving person. And just, and we can talk a little bit more about that, but maybe we can dive into that right now. I love this story that a friend of mine told me a couple of months ago, and this guy knew this. This guy just kind of knew intuitively what to do. He's a really good human being, and so. But anyway, he had a friend. He had a friend whose son had just committed suicide. A good friend, and so he goes over to the house, and he was the first one to get there. And it was 45 minutes before anybody else showed up. And so as Randy tells this story, he and his friend just sat there, side by side. Very, very few words were exchanged, and it's a rare person who feels comfortable doing that, for one thing. But maybe he patted his hand, maybe he did, but he just sat there with him, was with him. And I thought that was extraordinary in itself, but what was really important is that many, many years later, when this guy would see Randy, he would still talk about those 45 minutes as some of the most healing in this horrible journey that he was about to endure. And, speak about that a bit, if you would, and about creating a space for just being. The one-way intimacy is what you call it. Creating a space for a grieving person to just be what they're going to be, and then we can segue into more practical ways you can support a person who's grieving.
It was through the course of my practice, I would often end up spending time in a session talking with a client about their community, their loss, but also how their community responded, and how the community response was oftentimes creating a second layer of stress on their loss. So this story you just told is remarkable in somebody so intuitive to know. In 2025, there's a whole lot more language to understand the neurophysiology of safety and the neurophysiology of stress than we had when we wrote the book. And so what we would say now is, and this is the language that's come out of that, holding space, creating space. Oftentimes, understandably, the friend or the community to the grieving person is anxious about getting it wrong. And what's the typical thing we might say to ourselves on the way to a visitation or to see a bereaved friend? What am I going to say? What your friend did is what I teach and preach is change the focus to how can I be present? What kind of presence do I need to have to create the room that this person needs in order to be with their suffering, and to not try to, again, direct them, console them, change them. But yes, that is in a way, sort of, well, let me say it this way. A lot of folks I dealt with or worked with, excuse me, had a secondary loss in their life by losing some of their friendships over how that friend responded to them or abandoned them.
Right.
So again, the circle is to tell your story, you need a good story receiver. And that's another thing we know more about. We tell stories to help reorient ourselves out of the disorientation, to find a place to put our experience. And so I think it's not just a optional thing for most people. It becomes a very important thing. But as you and I have talked, oftentimes that attention wanes pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's and I'm guilty of this too. Some friend has suffered a great loss, and way too much time passes between reaching out. I just want to say that I love this conversation. It's healing for me to hear these things again and discuss them again. But there's a lot more stuff in the book. There's a lot more practical information. There are many more stories. I think you and I have both been extremely gratified by the stories we hear coming back from people who have read the book and have been helped. So it's Getting Grief Right, finding your story of loss and finding your story of love and the sorrow of loss. I know I'm biased, but I highly recommend it. I think that if you like what you're hearing now, I think that you would really benefit by getting the book. You're teaching at TCU now, and teaching medical students at TCU, a version of this, how to connect, how to create space, how to have human interactions with their patients, which I think that in recent times especially has become apparent as an essential part of the healing relationship. But so you were telling me the other day that I just think we need to talk about cliches, because cliches are a symptom of a lot. And, what you don't want to say, to a grieving person, and why you don't want to say that. Could you go there?
Yeah. Again, cliches are almost always for the speaker to have something to say. And let's don't make a judgment about intent. The intent may be righteous. The intent may be good. But a cliche is a series of words that are trite and overused and are essentially trying to spin the story in a certain direction. And there's kind of, we talk about in the book, 2 or 3 categories of cliches. There's sort of religious cliches. There's more, secular, time will heal kind of thing. You've got to move on. All of these cliches are rarely useful for the receiver, but it leaves the speaker filling in that space out of that, as you described a minute ago, that fear of silence, or I've got to do something. So, and another thing, I just taught this class at the medical school, so I had all the students say with me at the same time, at least. I said, all right, say it again. At least. We all said, at least. And then I said, never use those 2 words with a grieving person. Because that's another way of trying to spin it.
Right.
Because the next things that follow after the words at least are to say it could have been worse. I mean, there's some version of that. So words matter. And again, trying to stay in that space of suffering is very challenging for people, and I get it. But yes, no cliches. Don't start the sentence with at least. And try, if you're the helper, and we have a chapter in a book called Help for the Helper,
right,
which I think has been very, very useful for folks. Shift your consciousness out of what do I do, what do I say, to how do I be present. And if you're going to do something physical. Mow the grass, pick up the kids.
Right.
And to our point a minute ago, think about that past the first month, 3 months, 6 months.
I think that, we need to give people a little bit of grace in terms of not being terribly effective supporting a person who's been grieving. And I think a little knowledge goes a long way. But, when you think about it, every person goes into these very difficult situations with their own history, with
Right.
their own personality, with their own makeup. And for most people, going into that sort of situation is going to be difficult. It's going to be frightening. It could be for no other reason that, unfortunately, it's still pretty unusual. And so it's kind of counterintuitive, but nonetheless, it's essential for you to kind of turn that switch off and say, and I think to very consciously say, this isn't about me this time. And you describe it, being with a grieving person or supporting being a grieving person as a one-way intimacy. And I think that's what Randy, my friend, did. And again, it was remarkable that he knew to do that, because we just we're not taught to do those things. If anything, we're taught to do the opposite. Sometimes we want to fix people just because it's a kind of nice thing to want to fix people. You don't want them to suffer, but very often also it's like we don't want to suffer. And so it really takes, I think, short of kind of the spiritual, emotional foundation of naturally being a supportive person, I think that one of the things it really takes is information. It takes teaching. It takes intentionality. And I think that we can all do that. Let me, again, thank you for this. It brings back a lot of wonderful memories for me in terms of our collaboration and also the benefit that I've received from all the free therapy. But let's broaden out the thing. All these things I believe, if there's one criticism I would have with the book, is that it's to say, probably not correct to say it's too grief focused, but I believe that the principles that we have been talking about today, the principles that are talking about the book, can be applied to suffering, pain, inner pain of any stripe from any cause. And I think that, I've been trying to heal for 40 years, and I come a long way, and I've got a long way to go. But one of the things I've learned how to do over that time is to become a better friend to myself, and to become more accepting of those feelings, and to realize that at a fairly deep level, the only way past them is through them, and sit with them, not run from them. I mean, I know obviously I do this all very imperfectly, but there's that. So in closing, speak to in a more universal way how people can use these principles to deal with just kind of minimize it by saying garden variety suffering, or just kind of waking up one morning and saying, God, I just don't feel, I'm afraid of, just kind of the existential thing, or, any of the other losses and trials and tribulations we go through in life. How to use these principles to try to navigate those things.
Yeah, we separate, or we talk about death loss. This, again, is living loss. And the sort of trend in the last 10 years in psychology, as it's always evolving, has not eliminated the idea of working on your self-esteem, but it's increased the idea of self-compassion.
Right.
Which I think is a real significant, useful shift. And so when you talk about, I like your language, when you talk about being a friend to yourself, what you're describing is, how do you listen to yourself? I wake up, I'm in a certain state of mind. What's my mind, my body, my thoughts trying to tell me? And is there some suffering I need to pay attention to? Is there something that's going on? And always be conscious, I think, of this opening shame sentence, which is, what's wrong with me?
Right.
Instead, I think the teaching can be, what am I listening to? What am I hearing? What do I need to attend to? It's in a level of self-compassion, self-awareness, and don't judge any loss as too small. A loss is a loss, and it may be a smaller, medium, or large, but to all the living losses that are there, I believe there's a great power in naming what we are feeling. And the very naming of it starts to make that story shape, rather than all of the energy of resistance and self-criticism that can come.
I'd just to give the listeners the benefit of my own little tricks of the trade. My self-talk has really changed, and as part of this, it's like, basically, quite literally, it can often be, Tim, you're really suffering today. Are you really hurting today? Period. Full stop. Or my prayer would be, God, I'm really suffering today. Prayer, or period. Full stop. And then just sit. The other thing that I think has been important for me to realize is that I try to pay much less attention to what's going on in my mind and much more attention to what's going on in my body. That inner pain almost always registers in my body someplace. My own mantra is the mind lies, the body never does. And so, but and then I think a really important component of this is what we've been talking about all morning. It's like, I have these feelings. Sometimes I can connect them to something, sometimes I can't. But to go to a person you can trust and say, this is what's going on. Unvarnished, unedited. And, you and I have, every couple of months or so we get together and we'll talk about stuff, but invariably our thing goes to a place that's very deep and very honest. And that is how you bless me, and I hope that's how I bless you. That we can do that, without without fear, without hesitation. And I also have I'm blessed with a group of friends who, I have a small but mighty group of confidants and soulmates, if we want to use that kind of wimpy word, that we can do that. And I think we do that for each other. And I just think that life is hard, but that's okay. It is what it is. Life is hard, but we don't have to go through this alone.
And let me add to that something that we emphasize in the book, and that is sometimes what is very beneficial, and maybe all you have, is to write, is to journal. And as one of our, either we said it or one of our contributors said, oftentimes what comes to pen has not yet even come to mind.
Right.
And so, and we have a section in the book about how to do that, how to tell your story in writing by answering some questions, either individually or in a group. But yes, it's the same principle, and that is to have that story, have it shared, either through writing or through the kind of relationship you and I have or you have with other folks, is to do something with that suffering.
Yes.
That starts with acknowledgement.
Yes, yes. I find myself over the course of this conversation feeling even more convicted in the value of our book. It's Getting Grief Right, Finding Your Story of Love and the Sorrow of Loss. I think that you've graciously provided free therapy to all of our listeners, and once again me, and I thank you for that, and thank our producer Sam Esquivel for this creating this beautiful environment to have this conversation, and I guess we'll just kind of keep walking and see what happens. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. I'm very excited about the future of your podcast. I know there'll be some interesting folks that will sit in this chair, and we'll do more of kind of exploring what the human story is and how we can acknowledge who we are and live well.
That's, I was trying to come up with a clever intro for this, and what is this podcast going to be about? And I think that that is kind of what, you put it so well. Want to explore the human story and talk about things that too often don't get talked about, and witness anything mentionable. Well, I'm Tim Madigan, your host. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.